community-driven data for inclusive development. We'll be recording today's session, so that's an FYI. If you could go to the next slide, please, Mish. Thanks. As you might have seen from the panel description, we're going to hear from global youth change makers, policymakers, and development practitioners on the innovative and disruptive ways they leverage community-driven data for meaningful inclusion and equity. We see that the disconnect between public institutions and the communities they serve can further perpetuate socioeconomic inequities and mistrust, especially among marginalized populations. We'll discuss how inclusive data is essential for empowering individuals, communities, and institutions to deliver sustainable results for the whole of society, and why having inclusive data can help make more collective progress. After stories from all of our panelists, we'll have time for questions and discussions, so do add those to the chat for us to dig into later in the session. And next slide. Thank you. Before we dive into our discussion, if you could please open up the chat and introduce yourself using that chat function. Let us know your name, the organization that you're representing, and what motivated you to join this session. I'll give everyone a minute or so to share. Okay, there we go. Thanks, Marie-Claude. Again, just introduce yourself. Great to see you. And we've got people from all over the world joining, so that's great. You can go to the next slide. Mish, please. Thanks. Today, I am joined by Brenda Shum, the Youth Excel Regional Program Officer in Guatemala from IREX. And hopefully our colleague, Arthur Onyango, the Advocacy and Partnership Officer of Tinada Youth Organization, will be joining us, as well as Charlene Migwe Kagumi, a Senior Consultant with Development Gateway, one of my colleagues, and Marie-Claude Zando, the former Chief of Party of Development Gateway's De Chiffre and De June program in Côte d'Ivoire. Next slide. Thanks. While our panelists today are really going to dig deeper into this topic specifically, there's some context on inclusive data that might be helpful. We define inclusive data as the approach of more equitably representing and using data for all people, regardless of their community, ethnicity, gender, or age. Some benefits to using inclusive data for catalyzing impact include supporting bottom-up decision-making, increasing responsiveness to changing needs within communities, and fostering stronger community engagement and development implementation for more sustainable impact. I should note that inclusive data is not about checking boxes or using a specific framework. Instead, we want to think about inclusive data objective as a more inclusive approach to close data gaps that inadvertently facilitate discrimination and bias and monitoring evaluation and decision-making and programming for all of society. Next slide. And the final note I want to say is that this conversation is based on what some of you may know about a new partnership between Development Gateway and IREX. We've recently joined together in a strategic partnership with the goal of leveraging data to support communities to become more just, prosperous, and inclusive. IREX and Development Gateway have complementary strengths and portfolios. Development Gateway specializes in data, software development, and emerging technologies. We are experts at researching data ecosystems to identify incentives and barriers for data use, which some of our panelists will talk about. building technical tools for data support to support data analysis and visualizations and management, and advising on data strategy and policy to strengthen data-driven decision-making. Now, IREX in this partnership designs and implements a wide range of development programs that cultivate leaders, empower youth, strengthen institutions, and increase access to quality education and information. Many of IREX's programs are large and complex. IREX has a decades-long track record for working closely with government donors, multilateral organizations, foundations, and implementing partners to manage programs in an efficient way. And we hope that today's discussion reflects some of the new opportunities for our organizations to better cultivate trust, effective programming, and greater innovation for all. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Marie-Claude Zando, to start us off. Thanks, Marie-Claude.
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, my name is Marie-Claude Zando. I'm a former chief of party for the Chiffres des Jeunes, which is a project led by Development Gateway in Côte d'Ivoire. And I wanted to talk to you today about inclusive data for youth, citizens, and government, and how we're able to use those three pillars to have an inclusive process using data for decision making. So what's the vision for, what was the vision for the Chiffres des Jeunes? It was to have a better and enhanced data ecosystem in Côte d'Ivoire. We had specific objectives to get to this goal. One was to have an enabling environment for data sharing, for the use of data and sharing data. Also to increase the demand and supply of data. Another objective was to use youth as change agents in Côte d'Ivoire. And then once we have all this data flowing, we wanted to make sure that we had people that have the capability to use and manage those data. And all these should lead to a stronger data ecosystem in Côte d'Ivoire. Next, please. So we used several pillars to achieve our goal. One was youth, as I mentioned before, use youth as change agents. So we put together a data fellow program. So we recruited several youth to be data fellows. If you look at the number, you see that we had over 5,000 applicants. That means there was a need and a demand for better data management skills and wanting to know more about data. And we went through a very selective process to select 90 candidates. Next, please. Of which we trained 86, and we all.
Marie-Claude, can you hear us now?
If you look at the numbers, you see.
Oh, I think we lost you for a moment. Do you want to try to turn off your video while you present? Hi.
Yes, please. Hold on a second.
Hi. Okay, thank you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So, okay, good. So I was saying that we placed 56 of those fellows in government organizations and NGOs with the goal of having them shift the mentality around data and see the usefulness of data for decision making. They build solutions that were very useful for the people in the given the demand and supply of data in these organizations. Mish, can we go to the next, please? Can you hear me? Okay, so the second pillar that we use, can you still hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. So the second pillar was building the ecosystem. So we had ecosystem building activities. In these activities, we did an ODRA. ODRA is a tool from the World Bank that it's an open data readiness assessment. So it's a tool to evaluate the state of the particular country on open data. And to evaluate the capacity of data use in the government and also promote the release of open data, open government data. And we did that in partnership with the government through their Ministry of Planning and Development. And we did an action plan that was shared with the government with specific action points that they can use to put in place a better open data policy. We also did a workshop to using data management with government organizations. And we did training sessions with the government organization to train them on data management, basic data literacy for certain, and data science also. Next, please. The last pillar that I want to talk about was to talk about data with citizens. So we did 7 activities with citizens. One was mapping activities. We mapped a point of interest in a city called Dalwa, where we involve local youth communities. We also collaborate with OpenStreetMap to make sure that those youth have the capacity and learn how to collect data, using those data afterwards, how important it is to have those data points. And also we share that with government organizations within that city. Lastly, we built a data inventory platform to involve NGOs. We work with a partner, one of our partners, which has many NGOs. So we work with organizations which register on the platform, share the data sets, and also we talk to them about the importance of sharing data, being inclusive in managing the data. And so this platform, this mapping activity involves citizens, raise awareness around using data for decision making. The next slide, please. Numbers of the impact that the fellowship program had in the organization where we placed the fellows. So we had 182 tools and solutions built, tools around data reporting, a website, data quality control tools, dashboards, data collection and data storage tools. So those are things that we did so that people in the organizations understand the importance of being inclusive in collecting data and using data for decision making, and also seeing the value of having good and reliable. All these activities that we did were a good footstep for a better data ecosystem and a more inclusive data ecosystem in Côte d'Ivoire. And I think we were able to touch every single level of the population, the government, the youth, and the citizen in general. I'm going to stop there, and I'll have the opportunity to answer more questions during the Q&A session, and I'll hand it over to Charlene to talk to you about inclusive data for service delivery. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Marie-Claude. I think I'll just, for my presentation, and I'm excited to be here. My name is Charlene Migwe Kagume, based in Nairobi, and I'll focus mostly on service delivery and how inclusive data plays a really important role in that, and also focus a lot on our projects that we do on procurement transparency, which is a key theme in Development Gateway, because we understand the importance it does play in citizens' rights and in citizens' well-being. Yeah, so maybe we could go to the next slide. Great. So as I said, why procurement? And if you think about equitable service delivery, it all begins with procurement from a government perspective, as it is a means for governments to acquire goods and services for the citizens, more specifically its poorest and most vulnerable. And I think that goes back to what my colleague Sarah had mentioned at the beginning. The objective of inclusive data and our definition is around ensuring sustainable results for whole of society approaches. And why service delivery does touch clearly on that, because that's how citizens access health, all their basic needs through, most of their basic needs through government services. But if you think about the procurement process and how before it reaches the citizen, there's how governments prioritize. So they identify the service delivery needs to inform procurement planning. We need citizens there to be able to tell the government what they really need. In the contracting process, once they plan, they now come into choosing the right supplier, and it goes back to ensuring value for money through identifying suppliers who can provide relevant quality services. But how do governments know that the suppliers in the past have been providing the relevant services to citizens without knowing citizen feedback from that? And then lastly, of course, now citizens receive that service, such as healthcare, education, and sanitation. The next slide. So yeah, so how can we, from that slide, we've seen that citizens are an important key through that process. How do we bring them more? How are we more inclusive in bringing citizens to the discussion? And how can governments be more inclusive in their approach to procurement, including the data? As we said earlier, we're not just thinking of the data, but also just as approach as a whole, as governments becoming more inclusive. So the first step is data access. If you talk to citizens, I'm pretty sure even myself as a citizen, before I started working on procurement, realize procurement does sound like a very technical issue. So citizens would shy away from procurement in some of the assessments that we've done, but making this data more accessible and making the processes more relevant to citizens would bring them onto the table. But then also sharing stuff like what the work we've seen, contract milestones and bill of quantities, where when a supplier is being contracted, it says this is actually what you're supposed to deliver. Of course, contract milestones, we know the timelines, etc. are all important data points for citizens to have to better understand what service they're supposed to receive at the end of the day. But then now, once the citizens have this data, are there feedback mechanisms for citizens to give their representative views in the analysis of service delivery? Can citizens come and tell you this hospital is not complete, or it's not accessible to women, or there are issues with people with disabilities through access points? How can you know that services that are being delivered by suppliers are actually accessible by all citizens? And then the last and most importantly, of course, is how do governments use this feedback? So here you're a government official getting all this feedback from different sources. Should governments be strengthened to analyze this data, look at trends, and be able to make decisions to be able to address key service delivery gaps for particular groups? The next one. So what if we didn't include citizens' feedback? What if we didn't have inclusive data? We didn't have data from citizens themselves or from civil society or just media who actually see what's happening on the ground to key decision makers. As I said, there'll be lack of inclusivity in contract implementation results in communities lacking access to basic services such as health, sanitation, and education. And through the work that we've done, before we roll out our contracting work, we do assessment and see some of the gaps to why citizens are, or what are the gaps and why governments are not being inclusive. One of them is communities lack understanding, as I mentioned, of public procurement, participation processes, very key, because how will they be able to engage government better? Funny enough, we've also seen private sector be a key, a very big gap with private sector in how to engage government better in some of the issues in terms of contracting. As I said, lack of feedback mechanisms. So it leads to an incomplete picture by government on whether citizens are actually receiving the services that they need. Yeah, and back to lack of insight analysis on whether the contracts are being implemented, whether they're benefiting all the target groups, including women and people with disabilities. On to the next. Yeah, a quick case study is for the Kenyans, the House, Makueni and Elgeyo Marakwet County. They currently have project management committees, and they're made up of community members who review suppliers' performance before the supplier is paid. I found that quite extraordinary that a government would allow citizens to determine whether a supplier is paid. And this report does, and they're given the BQs, they're given the contract milestones, and they're able to see, does this really fit us as citizens? And that's a way of being inclusive in our data approach on getting feedback from the ground before suppliers are paid. But the challenge with that is some of these community structures are not institutionalized. As you all know, Kenya is going through an election in August this year. If, for example, if new governors come, how do we ensure that, or new governments come in, how do we ensure some of these already existing structures stay beyond different government tenures? Lastly, we supported them, of course. Right now, before they were doing like handwritten reports, which may be lost in translation, or government may have a challenge with analyzing some of this data and seeing trends in supplier performance, or it's seeing trends in particular sales sectors such as health, etc. So helping them to digitize that process will support in better use of that data in itself. So lastly, the next slide. So what next? As I mentioned, there needs to be two-pronged approach, not just from citizen stakeholder perspective, but particularly government. So ensuring data is accessible to citizens in the right format. As civil society of development partners, we could support governments in systems that could support making BQs, contract milestones, etc. more accessible to citizens, supporting the strengthening of feedback mechanisms. Technology plays a really big role in that, in the analysis of that feedback, and even in the processes itself. We could have analysis, but are some of these feedbacks and the data from communities being actually used in cabinet meeting decisions, high-level decisions that can really change service delivery? And on the stakeholders, build capacity of citizens on procurement processes to action. As I said, citizens, procurement is just a scary term in itself. Secondly, building capacity of media. I think we've seen in our in implementing procurement and transparency, media plays a really important role in demystifying procurement, in flagging corruption cases, and in also in flagging also service delivery issues and getting feedback from the ground also. And of course, civil society engagement and capacity building to convene citizens and communicate to governments on key issues. So on that, I'll hand it over back to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Charlene, and thank you, Marie-Claude. I'll hand it over to Brenda and Arthur now.
Thank you so much. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon. Youth Excel is a 30 million global cross-sectoral positive youth development activity. We are in our second year of implementation, working with over 70 local organizations in 12 countries so far. Youth Excel is committed to the promotion of implementation research efforts that generate evidence for youth programming, therefore strengthening institutional capacities in youth-led and youth-serving organizations, as well as prioritizing inclusion and underrepresented groups. Implementation research challenges traditional views on data and demands new lenses to look into data to draw conclusions that can propose solutions to the issues that the communities face. I am Brenda Schum. I am the Regional Program Officer of Youth Excel. I am currently based in Guatemala City, and we are currently working on the implementation of a Youth Excel flagship activity that we call an issue-based collaborative network in Quetzaltenango, Guatemala. We work with an anchor partner and 11 youth-led and youth-serving organizations that are currently working on presenting the results of the implementation research efforts that they have gone through. Can we go to the next slide, please? So when we talk about inclusive data, we believe that inclusive data specifically shows the complexity of youth and their realities. Data is data that makes visible the realities of minorities and provides an intersectional lens to the communities that we are working with. Therefore, it is important to ask ourselves questions to validate data, such as who decides what data to collect, who collects the data, who analyzes the data, and also more challenging questions that are like, is data owned by the community? Is data going back to the community for their use, or is it being extracted? Are we designing and building processes that demand inclusive data on the populations that we're focused on? In this slide, you can see how inclusive data shows that it's not the same to talk about youth from an urban area who has had the opportunity to access to formal education and speaks the national language, compared to youth that may come from rural areas and may not have had the opportunity to study in formal education and may speak even an indigenous language, not the national one. And it is because of this difference that for these differences that inclusive data matters. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what happens when inclusive data is not available to decision makers? we believe that it unconsciously, contributes to the invisibilization of community problems and takes away power from the communities to act on them. It also continues this vicious circle of exclusions, which means that problems that affect excluded groups are not seen by decision makers, and therefore there are no actions to address them. One of the examples that we have seen in the implementation of our issue-based collaborative network is the youth-led organization called Acción Social Maíz. Their leaders thought that the reasons behind youth not being able to access to job opportunities in the locality was because of the lack of skills in building a CV and a cover letter. During the implementation research process that they carried on, and by collecting inclusive data, they were able to learn that the lack of opportunities are even deeper for youth from marginalized communities, regardless of the skills that they may have or not in building a professional profile. So this is an example of how the lack of data leads to inaccurate solutions and inaccurate decisions. And in this case, the lack of opportunities and the lack of inclusive data led to youth even feeling, more discouraged about their job perspectives and limiting even more their opportunities. I think we believe that this is an example of how inclusive data helps decision makers to understand these problems more deeply. And now I will let the time to my colleague, Arthur, who will continue the conversation on inclusive data.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to use multiple devices because of a challenge. Basically, I'm from Tinada Youth Organization. And our organization focuses on ensuring inclusion of persons with disabilities. Apart from that, we work in the area of mental health, reproductive health, and gender equality, where we also work on reproductive health. So we were answering pretty much the same question, and also we were trying to solve our problems by answering the question of what does inclusive data look like and what does it mean to us? And inclusive data for our organization means that having all marginalized persons included in data collection processes with data collection methods that foster participation from marginalized groups. In our instance, we managed to ensure that all marginalized groups, in this instance, we are working with persons with disabilities. There are various issues that prevents persons with disabilities from participating in generation and also in just making their voices be heard. Particularly, we were looking at the deaf in this instance. The deaf require some help to be able to communicate with people who have the ability to hear, which is a sign language interpreter. And if you look in the picture on that slide, you'll notice that there is a lady next to a door trying to interpret for a deaf person so that he is able to contribute to the focus group discussion on disability inclusion that we were conducting during Youth Excel. And our focus was on economic inclusion of persons with disabilities, ensuring reasonable accommodation. Please move to the next slide. And this is basically also continuing to explain what I was just talking about, what happens when inclusive data is not available for decision makers. So the most important thing that happens is that there's an intentional structural exclusion, which means no one really wishes to exclude persons with disabilities or a minority group or a marginalized group, but it happens because their voices are not heard. And also another thing that happens is that there is a product mismatch. When products are made to serve persons with disability or any other marginalized group, there is limited efficiency because the products that are made for them are not actually serving the purpose that they were intended to serve, because they do not match the exact needs or the situation of the people that the product was made for. And look at the example on the slide, and we'll say that you see a an organization called Youth Alive that was also participating in ICON found out that 30% is set aside for government access to government procurement opportunities is set aside for persons with disability, women, and youth. And they realized that only 2% of this got to youth with disability. And this is in the backdrop that persons with disabilities who we interviewed showed greater interest, but greater inability to access the facilities that exist. On the other side, you also notice that there are available business support for persons with disabilities, and 70.3% of PWDs, those are persons with disabilities that we interviewed, did not receive business support, despite the same interviews showing that they had greater preference for self-employment. So that shows how that affects, when inclusive data isn't there, it affects the communities that we try to serve. And we also look at what it does. It reinforces the biases that the marginalized group are already facing. Their communities have formed opinions and biases against marginalized group. And when they are unable to use the services that are there, for instance, persons with disabilities in my country, most of them are poor, and sometimes there could be a bias that they would like just to be pitied and be looked at as a very special group that is requiring overly special attention, yet the products that are made are not fit for them. And lastly, and overall to crown all this discussion, is that it raises the cost of development due to waste as a result of product mismatch and unresolved development question. When the issues of persons with disabilities among other marginalized groups are not solved, that is a section of the population that is left behind, and that is additional cost and additional weight on the economy and also on development that should have been solved if there was inclusive data to make the decision that would inform accurately what kind of products would be made that would serve the group. Please, the next slide. So basically, this talks about how we see demand for inclusive data can be built. It takes a pyramid shape because there is a base and there is an apex where we achieve all. But basically, let me go back to just think about what demand looks in our eyes. Demand looks like a person being willing to have something, needs something, is willing to have something, and is able to acquire it. So in this context, we are looking at data where the communities are willing to have it, they need it, and they are able to acquire it. So the first thing that needs to be done, that is at the base, what is written number 3, dismantling the traditional notions of research and embracing accessible methods. Believing that communities and people who really need data can generate the data they need, and that basically is the base of us getting out of making data for a special or a secluded group of people to democratizing data to everyone who needs it. And then secondly, after dismantling these traditional notions, then we empower these communities that require data. And we empower them to be able to identify their data needs and be able to generate. This requires, like what Youth Excel did, they trained young people, they trained all of us so that we are able to generate the data that we need within our organizations to be able to develop products that better serve the community. And then lastly, most importantly, is also building teams with data experts. In this context, I mean people with great experience. I'm not saying that there are groups of people who cannot generate data, but I mean that there are people who have a lot of experience in using data, generating data, and also can advise on ensuring that there is data quality, because that is also important. And there are people in these communities who have local knowledge and know exactly where the problems are most pressing. So when these two people or these two groups of people unite together to work, then we find these great results in terms of development. Then we resolve many development questions and we move forward much faster. Thank you.
Thank you very
Yes.
much, everyone. Thank you, Arthur and Brenda and Charlene and Marie-Claude. We're going to now move into a discussion. And if you've got, and this includes a Q&A as well. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. But I have a few to kick us off. Arthur, you mentioned the building of demand for inclusive data. And I'd like to hear from each of our panelists if they've seen an appetite for inclusive data. So data demand, and if you've seen, if you have particular examples of where you've seen this demand grow, and who within the institutions that you're working with have shown the most appetite or are the most open to working with inclusive data. And I don't know if anybody wants to kick us off with an example first, but happy to open it up to any of you.
Okay, let me just begin because probably I'm still having the momentum of the discussion. And I will just mention a decision maker, one that I've seen very interested in inclusive data. And she is our advisor to the governor on persons with disabilities. And she's a female, and she has been working with the previous regime. She was working in the parliament, the county parliament, on inclusion. Then in the current regime, she is now the advisor of the governor, and she is very interested and also looks forward to using the data that we generate to also improve the services that the government of Kisumu County is, and the services of Kisumu County. And that, I think, it's a plus. And also, as an organization, we have the need for inclusive data. We have always believed in research to build our work. However, ICON empowered us more because we were able to now get data as we go on with the work we do. So we are able to shape our programs as we go. ICON, I believe Brenda has spoken a little about the definition. And so the process, participating in ICON was an eye-opener. Yes, we have been trying, and particularly the courses around gender and social inclusion were very eye-opening, and they informed us on what we are doing. And apart from just empowering us to be able to work with data as we go, it also enhanced our desire to be more inclusive. Thank you.
Maybe I can
go Brenda.
Thank you, Charlene. Yeah, I think in Guatemala, at least, I don't think that we have a specific example, but I think maybe the organizations that are implementing their research activities, now that they are reflecting in their findings, one of the things that we have reflected on is that it is very important to promote consciousness around the usefulness of inclusive data to local leaders. And this, I think we believe it goes beyond, not only producing the data, but also like to actually use it and empower the communities to demand this data. I think along with it, it's very important to also promote intergenerational and intersectoral data, which means that we also need to continue engaging key stakeholders, institutions, allies, etc., so that way we can also change dynamics of powers, because it's very interesting to see how, when inclusive data comes up, you usually also power relationships comes up as well. So we believe that inclusive data continues to promote, this unveiling of these inequalities, and especially the realities of so many communities, that their reality is so complex that if we really want to impact them and find solutions to the issues that they are facing. Inclusive data plays a very important role on it. So, Charlene?
Yeah, I'll add on to what Brenda said, especially about the citizens. Particularly in my country, we've seen situation where there's apathy towards engaging government and thinking that our engagement will go nowhere. So we've had feedback mechanisms in the past, but the government is not being as responsive to needs of the citizens. So I think the biggest way to generate that interest for citizens to give their feedback and for their data to be used and for more inclusive growth and service delivery is for governments to act on it and to also strengthen government to use some of this feedback mechanism. But I think from government side, from the counties, we've been engaging some subnationals here. We've seen a lot of demand for what Arthur had mentioned about access to government procurement opportunities, where in Kenya, they're supposed to give 30% to women, youth, and people with disabilities. A number of them are not getting to that 30%. They don't know why. So understanding that disaggregation of what are these standards that the youth are not getting, which are the ones women are applying and they're not getting, why are they not getting, are the tender documents too hard to understand, just trying to figure out what are the challenges, and data seems to be a demand for them to further diagnose and try to get to that 30%. But also from their M&E departments outside procurement, and thinking about right now, M&E departments have been strengthened at the subnational level, but they just know that they're just supposed to understand who are the beneficiaries, etc. But they have not really disaggregated those beneficiaries and to be able to track who the services are really impacting. It's something that's been a key challenge. And they'll be asking for disaggregated data to better understand whether they're actually reaching their target beneficiaries.
Let me add something. In the process of the project, we had several awareness raising activities, meetings with people at the subnational level, just to talk to them about data and the usefulness of data. And you could see, once they understand what data can do for them, you can see the need they have for government to understand what's going on in their life through data that will be collected at their level. I think the first thing is for people, at least in Côte d'Ivoire, is for people to even understand what a data is and how it could be used. And then it triggers that demand for data, or that demand for more inclusive data. Even when we did the data, the platform, a lot of NGOs didn't know that sharing data could be useful, could help them as a collective group. And once we have this platform in place, you could see the feedback from these organizations who share the data, where they understand that sharing data means inclusive to other people than themselves, and it could be helpful at the end. So I think just a general awareness of what data is, how it could be used, and how it could help the community triggers that demand for data.
Thank you very much. And we have a question from Karen at GPSDD, and I can read it for the panelists. I'm keen to hear from the speakers, what have you observed as the characteristics of a decision maker who cares about inclusion and inclusive data? What are some of the barriers to using data and inclusive data specifically that the decision makers you have interacted with highlight? It's a great question, Karen, and one that I think I've definitely heard before. So I'm interested to hear what our panelists have to say.
I'm gonna try to give my own experience. I
You
think.
can hear me? Hello.
Yes, Arthur.
Okay.
Hi.
So one of the challenges that I've found decision makers finding difficulty with using inclusive data is the data source. You'll always be asked, what is the source of your data? So the sources that are more accessible, the sources, for instance, if young people get out there and speak and gather data about their issues, or if persons with disabilities without certain credentials in the community go out there and gather data about their issues, it will not be trusted. So yes, it is inclusive. Yes, they have done their best to speak their knowledge from, also because they understand their issues and they understand where it presses the most. But who will listen to them when they are not doctors, when they are not professors, when they do not have PhD? So it is critical to ensure that there is that question of how do we best make sure that people believe that everyone can produce data that speaks to their problem. So that is a key issue to look at as we also think about inclusive data.
Marie-Claude, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think one of the main issue that I've noticed is even for decision making to be afraid of open data, to have those data available to all, talking about from bottom up, because maybe culturally the government had this way of hiding data. So open data, sharing data, including all the citizens in the data collection and the decision-making process is kind of threatening to them. But then, when you show them the benefit, then it shifts this mentality, it shifts this culture that they have. And I think it's a process. It's going to take time. We just need to continue to have projects where we show how open data is useful, inclusive data is useful for the community as a whole, and then it's going to bring those barriers down.
Yeah,
Go next.
to add on, Brenda, we only speak the same time.
Charlene,
Okay.
you go first.
Okay, so I think I'll add on the characteristics. Thanks, Karen, for that question. I think the ones who have been interested in inclusive data all align to bringing citizens' views, being more inclusive as not just the data itself, but as the approach. So how they go beyond just the data, but how to engage and be more open in terms of setting up the processes for dialogue with citizens, with media, private sector, just engaging stakeholders as a whole. But I think from the barriers, the key things that we've seen is capacity. So time and staff issues, as you know, as for example, the subnational level, once you do an assessment and you want to roll out something that allows for publishing of data, you'll need data interns, you need all that stuff. As we all know, hiring out at government level is not as easy. But I think the biggest is the buy-in and continuity. So as I said, we're going to elections. All the governors we're engaging right now are worried about how they can entrench the data, the inclusive data approach into new governments when they're gone. But importantly, even entrench it within their institutions themselves. For example, procurement is a function of every single department. So every minister is in charge of procurement of their own stream. How can you create buy-in even if the governor has agreed to it? How is it trickle it down? And we've seen counties taking even a year or so to build capacity, to train, set up systems, come up with strategies with them, just to make them more included into the process to ensure the continuity of inclusive data approaches. So over to you, Brenda.
Thank you, Charlene. Well, I have to say that in the implementation of an issue-based collaborative network in Guatemala, we have seen two scenarios. The first one is that we have seen the decision makers that are a little bit more young, that actually come, from backgrounds that are historically in Guatemala been marginalized, are more open to inclusive data. So that's one of the things that we have seen actually in Quetzaltenango, which is where we are implementing the icon. And we think that, decision makers that are a little bit more in the age group of the youth that we are working with, and also that live in the same communities where this data is being generated, feel a little more identified with inclusive data and are more open to receive it. And now, in the other hand, talking about the challenges, something very interesting that we have seen is that data that is being produced by young organizations and youth-led organizations, and that are following an implementation research project, have been questioned, on their methods of collecting that data, and sometimes have been even disregarded because they think or they have said openly that they want data, or that they are demanding data that is more scientifically produced. So that's very interesting, we believe, because inclusive data has this challenge of proving itself, to actually reflect the reality, but sometimes very traditional ways of seeing how data is collected can be a barrier, for more traditional people to actually accept inclusive data. So we have seen this tendency of being very critical, to inclusive data because it's being produced by young-led organizations, like I said, and youth in general specifically, that it's been like, we believe that it's like even more questioned. And that's something that we have found that is very interesting, because like I said before, we come back to those power differentials, adults not listening to young organizations and youth in general.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I do wonder how much any of the other data sources that are used are questioned for their scientific rigor. But I know that the Youth Excel team is working hard to make sure that the rigor is backed up. So hopefully the questions decrease. So we have about 5 minutes left, and there's some great discussion going on in the chat. One thing that we haven't touched on that I would love to hear just, a 30-second snippet from our panelists, if you'd like to weigh in, is if and how using inclusive data, collecting inclusive data, seeing yourself in the data actually adds to trust in institutions, because this is what we're talking about, right? Is how this can add to trust, how we limit the disconnect between people and the institutions in which exist to serve society. So if you want to take 30 seconds to touch quickly on anything to do with trust here, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I would add something to it, and I think that implementation research and the institutions that we are working with actually builds on their own institutional capacity. And it's very interesting, like in the example that I showed, how institutions can feed themselves, from the data that they are collecting by doing very simple things like asking the youth that they are working with and that they serve, their point of view, their opinions, and just, provide that room for young people to sort of like learn too from the actions that they are implementing. We believe that that's very, very important, and it's a process that have strengthened actually the organizations, because now they can promote better solutions to the localities because of this process of collecting data from the communities to see what best serves them and works for them.
Thank you. Any other of the panelists want to jump in? Arthur?
Thank you. And one thing that I believe inclusive data does to organizations, especially youth-led organizations that use inclusive data, it builds trust because of the products you build. When you create products that really match what people need, then people are happy, you are also happy. But when you don't build products that people don't need, you are not happy. The people are not also happy. So it builds trust, and it also makes programs more economical. I think so.
I think it goes back to my point on governments have to be responsive for inclusive data to make sense. And as we said, from the perspective of procurement and service delivery, if government has committed to getting citizen feedback and using that inclusive data to be able to address key service delivery issues and just make service delivery work for everyone, and that's not happening, then the trust is not going to be there. But I think if we're able to have better dialogue, other processes beyond the data, where citizens can air their views, media, private sector can all be in the same room and discuss key issues and come up with key gaps and priorities, I think that's the only way that it can generate trust. And as I said, through the different levels, from the planning stage, citizens are heard, to the contracting stage, and to actually giving feedback on what they receive. I think that's the best way to build trust.
Thank you very much. And we've got about a minute left, so I'm just going to close this out. I've really appreciated all of the sharing today and all of the discussion in the chat. We're really excited about the strategic partnership between Development Gateway and IREX, really thinking about how can data help to build more responsive institutions, and that includes trust, that includes inclusive institutions. So please do follow along with our work on our Twitters, blogs, etc. And hopefully we can follow this conversation up on Twitter or a blog post itself, because I'm really excited about what we've talked about today. And as a quick recap, we really dug into demystifying a lot of the institutional processes that exist. And I think that having inclusive data approaches can help support that demystification of complex processes. So thank you so much again, and thanks to Mish for providing technical support, and to all the panelists for joining throughout your day. I know we're in a number of different time zones, and of course to the IREX team for hosting us. So thanks, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.